Folktales and fairy tales are another form of traditional literature, and folktales are stories about people, animals, or supernatural beings, and the purpose is to convey the values of the culture in which the folktale originates, as well as universal human truths. And a fairy tale is a variation of a folktale, but they usually include elements that are very magical or supernatural. So a fairy tale might include something like a witch or a dragon or a fairy, whereas a folktale usually includes things that we find in the natural world. Although a folktale might have some magical element like a talking animal, usually in a folktale that is strictly a folktale and not a fairy tale, we won't find things like dragons and fairies and witches and things of that nature. And usually with folktales and fairy tales, we see that good is rewarded and evil is punished. For example, one of my favorite folktales comes from Louisiana, and it's called The Talking Eggs, and it's written by Robert Sansucci and illustrated by Jerry Pinkney, whose illustrations I just love. And this is a story of two sisters that live in the woods. One is very good, very sweet, very kind, and does all the family's chores. The other is a lazy, evil sister, and the evil sister is in cahoots with the mom, and neither of them like the good sister, whose name is Blanche. And one day, Blanche leaves home crying and upset because her mother and sister have been very mean to her, and she comes across this old woman who happens to be a witch. And the woman invites Blanche into her house and tells Blanche, you know, you're going to see some pretty crazy things going on in my house. You have to promise not to laugh at them and promise to follow my rules. So Blanche, being as good as she is, does follow all of the witch's rules and guidelines. And at the end of Blanche's visit with the witch says, well, you can go out to my hen house and you can take the eggs. But you can only take the eggs that give you permission to take them. So you can't take the eggs that say, don't take me. So Blanche goes into this hen house, and all of these really beautiful eggs with like gold and jewels on them are saying like, don't take me. Whereas these like ugly, rather plain eggs are saying, take me, take me. So Blanche, being as good as she is, follows directions, and she only takes the eggs that are saying, take me. And along the way, you know, from the witch's house to home, these eggs turn into these beautiful riches, like a carriage and a beautiful horse and beautiful clothing and jewels. So Blanche is rewarded for her goodness and for following directions. Well, of course, when she gets home with all these fine things, her evil sister and her mother are like, where did you get those things? And Blanche tells them. So the evil sister goes and does the same thing, meets the witch, just as Blanche had, but the evil sister doesn't follow directions, and she ends up taking those bejeweled eggs that are saying, don't take me. And it turns out those eggs are filled with really vile things like animals and bees that come chasing after her. So we can see in this story that the good sister Blanche, who follows directions, is rewarded, whereas the evil sister, who is nasty and makes fun of people and doesn't follow the rules, is punished in this story. So we can see that this story really adheres very closely to the fairy tale genre, because, you know, we have this magical witch and we have good rewarded as well as evil being punished. Others include Little Red Riding Hood. I really like this version by Trina Shart Hyman, which received I think it was a Caldecott honor when it was published in the early 1980s. It's a very traditional Little Red Riding Hood story where Little Red Riding Hood goes to visit her sick grandmother, happens upon the wolf who eats her and the grandmother, and they are saved by the good huntsman. Baba Yaga is another one that I really like, and this is a Russian fairy tale, and it's about, much like Blanche and the Talking Eggs, or much like Little Red Riding Hood, it's about a little girl who's wandering in the forest, and she has a wicked housekeeper who doesn't like her, and this kind girl in Baba Yaga, her name is Katrina, she eventually runs into this evil witch named Baba Yaga. But along the way, Katrina is helping all these things like a rusty gate and a dog that needs its fur combed. And when Katrina is captured by Baba Yaga, all her kind deeds from the gate and the dog, among other things, are rewarded, and they help her defeat Baba Yaga. And that's one I really like, because Baba Yaga is just kind of weird. Like, she lives on this house with chicken feet. It's kind of weird. But I don't know. I guess I like weird, and it's always interesting to see, you know, that sort of thing, I guess, in a book. So why not? It's fun. Blond Popo is another one, and some people consider this to be very similar to Little Red Riding Hood stories. And this story comes from China, and it's about three sisters, and they're home alone, and this wolf comes to the door trying to get in. But the oldest sister is very clever, and she finds a way to outwit the wolf. And what I really like about Blond Popo is we have a female character who defeats the wolf through her smarts. So I really like to see a clever, strong female character, and I really like that this story includes that in it. So perhaps some of the best known fairy tales and folk tales, at least in many cultures in the Western Hemisphere, would be the fairy tales and folk tales from the Brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm. And the Brothers Grimm did not write fairy tales and folk tales. Instead, they were collectors of fairy tales and folk tales. And they went around to people in Europe, namely in the German countryside, and collected these stories that had been told by families in Germany and other countries for many, many generations. And they created, or they drafted multiple versions of their collection of fairy tales that they were constantly revising and updating with other stories that they came across. So many stories that you may be familiar with already, like Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel, these we usually attribute to the Brothers Grimm. Now, keep in mind, the Brothers Grimm merely collected these stories. They did not actually write these stories. And if you are fascinated by these fairy tales and folk tales like I am, one book I would recommend to you is Fairy Tales from the Brothers Grimm by Philip Pullman, who is a well-known children's and young adult author. And what he has done is written in English these versions of the stories from the Brothers Grimm. And I think what I like, which might sound a little weird, is that they're just as like macabre as the original stories. Like as we've mentioned in other lectures, many of these folktales can be very like violent and grotesque, and there's just something interesting and fascinating almost about like how strange some of these stories are. Like there's one that I remember reading in this book called Hans My Hedgehog about a baby born with a hedgehog's head, and it's just so bizarre. It's intriguing to read. So if you like that sort of thing, or at least fascinated by it, then I definitely recommend that you read this book, because I think that the author tries to stay pretty close to the original versions of the stories as they were written by the Brothers Grimm. And as mentioned previously, many traditional stories, we can find versions of them across cultures, and fairy tales and folktales are no exception. There is a great diversity of well-known fairy tales and folktales. For example, we talked in another lecture about the Cinderella story. Well, many of us are familiar with, the French or the German version of the Cinderella story, which is the one that the Disney movie that many people have seen is based on. But so many cultures have their own version of the Cinderella story that grew up or were developed independently of the Cinderella story that many people in Western cultures tend to know. For example, there are American versions of Cinderella stories, like Moss Gown is one from the American South. Ashpet is another one that features a character from Appalachia. We also have Native American cultures that have their own type of Cinderella-like story, like the Roughest Girl, which is about a girl who her face is ruined, and she claims that she can see this beautiful invisible being, and the idea is that anybody who can see the invisible being gets to marry him. And all these girls are saying, "Oh, I see the invisible being," and his sister is trying to test them, like, "Well, what does he look like? What does he have? What's his weapon?" and so forth. But only the rough-faced girl, who has an ugly face but a really kind heart, is actually able to see him and answer the sister's questions. And so she gets rewarded by being able to marry the invisible being, where all these girls who said they could see him are really liars, and they're shown up for the fact that they are liars. Euphara's Beautiful Daughters is one that I really enjoyed as a child, and I first became introduced to it because LeVar Burton talked about it on Reading Rainbow. And it's still a book that I love, and it's an African version of the Cinderella type story. And just like with the Western version that many people in the United States are familiar with, kindness is rewarded in this story, where the kind sister gets to marry the king and be the queen at the end of the story. And there's an author, Shirley Climo, who has collected a number of other Cinderella stories from cultures. Like she's written, or retold rather, the Korean Cinderella. I also really like the Irish Cinderlad, which is cool because we have a male Cinderella. So to speak, when we have all these cultural variations of a similar story, it's a really wonderful way to show students that across cultures, many common traits like kindness are valued. And also these sorts of books can expose students to different cultures and different styles of artwork, and so forth. So they're really a wonderful teaching tool that I strongly recommend that you include in your classroom one day.